Assalamualaikum everyone. I would like to share with you this philosophy and philosophy education as part of the introductory of our course more on philosophical foundation of peace education. So according to Glaser, getting a job done, even well done, is good enough for non-professional, but continually improving the way the job is done, both for themselves and others, is the hallmark of professionals. So we are all professionals. So therefore, this is a continual improving way of our job. You are now PhD, almost finished in your PhD. So supposed to be this is the first subject, a major subject in our course, but since this is not a prerequisite, so we take it this semester, the philosophical foundation of peace education. Then what about the so-called philosophy? There are a lot of definitions of philosophy. The etymological meaning of philosophy comes from the two Greek words philo as well as sophia. Philo, which is a friend or love, then sophia, which means wisdom. So literally, philosophy is the love of wisdom. So that's the literal meaning of the word philosophy. Once again, comes from the two Greek word philo and sophia. Philo meaning friend, then sophia, wisdom. Philo, it also means love. So therefore, nangingibig ng karunungan ang filosofiya. That's why it is a search for wisdom. And what about this wisdom? We want to know the deepest knowledge or the deepest meaning of the world. Then, the philosophy of education, it is said that it provides a framework of thinking about educational issues and the dilemmas, and it guides professional practice. So we are all professionals. Some of you, you are educator by profession, but you opted to take up this philosophy major in peace and development. So now we move on. We have also the so-called normative philosophy. This is the way. It's all about education, architecture, medicine, or any other profession, all to practice within the environment. And philosophy is also a perception because I think you had already your background in some of the philosophy subjects when you were still in college. So this is just a sort of review. That's why, uh, in our own way, we can be a philosopher. We will be, or you can be a philosopher in your own way. And of course, doctor of philosophy kayo. So therefore, we are philosophers. Nangingibig ng karunungan. Okay. What about philosophy and theory? You know very well. You know already the meaning of philosophy. Okay. Kaya nga in Latin, we have also the common definition. When I was in the seminary, when we talk about philosophy. Uh, Philosophia scientia rationalis omnium rerum suprema et causas, which means that it deals with everything, with its first cause. That's philosophy. Then what about theory? Theory is more on the mind without thinking of its application. That's why it is said theory is ideas, more on the mind. Then it is based from observation and used to explain also that observation. Then philosophies as based on theories or the beliefs explain the way the things are, ought to be, and people's thoughts and emotions, the concepts over long periods of time. That's more on theory. That's more also on philosophy, only in the mind. There are a lot of branches of philosophy, and it's divided into category. The practical one as well as the other one is more on the theoretical. Now, in this branch, this is more on theoretical. Theoretical, as we had in our first slides, it's more on the mind. It's more on idea without thinking its application. So the following are parts of the major branches of philosophy, but it is more on theoretical philosophies. First is the epistemology. examines the question on how we come to know what we know. So this is also coming from the a Greek word episteme, and the second is logos. So comes from the two Greek word episteme as well as logos. So episteme, which means knowledge, then logos meaning study or a word. So literally, epistemology is the study of knowledge. Kaya nga examines questions on how we come to know what we know. So it talks about knowledge. That's more on epistemology. Then second is metaphysics. When I took up my philosophy in the seminary, one of the difficult subject or branch of philosophy is metaphysics. Metaphysics comes from the two Greek word meta, then physikon. So meta, which means beyond, then physikon, physical. It talks about matter. It talks about thing. Kaya nga sinasabi to sa Filipino itong meron, ang pagka-meron. Then, this is more or less related also to ontology. Ontology comes from the two Greek word onta, which means the really existing things, as well as logi or the logos, so study about being, also the really existing things. That's why it considers the nature of the reality, the re in Latin, reality. What is real? That's more on ontology as well as metaphysics. So they are, kumbaga, first cousin yung dalawa as branch of theoretical branch of philosophy. Then another is axiology. Axiology, this is more on the practical branch of philosophy, considers the question on values and ethics. And why? Because axiology comes from the Greek word axios, which means worthiness or a value, then logos. So therefore, axiology is the study of values or ethics. So it talks about the good and the bad, the wrongness and badness of one's action. Then another branch also under the practical philosophy is logic. Examines the processes of deriving valid conclusions from basic principles. Bakit ganon? Kasi logic comes from the Greek word logike, which means the intelligible. Okay? That's why the other meaning of logic, di ba? It talks about the correctness of one's thinking. Okay? The right thinking, the correct thinking. That's more on logic. That's why it examines the processes of deriving valid conclusions from the basic principles. Siguro kung nung nasa college kayo, 'di ba, yung may mga logic noon, and I think dumaan kayo doon, 'di ba? Ano ka ba? Wala kang logic, ibig sabihin wala kang correct thinking. Okay? So it develops, kaya nga sa logic doon na siguro nakita nyo, may may debate pa yan, then you know the fallacies, there are I think 8 fallacies na pinag-aralan ninyo para ma-correct talaga yung pag-iisip ng tao. So that's more on the practical as well as the theoretical branches of philosophy. At marami pa yan ha, may iba pa. Pero ito lang yun dito ang nakafocus on this topic. Then we have the traditional schools of philosophy. So si binanggit natin kanina, the metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, as well as the so-called educational implications. So in metaphysics, when we talk about idealism, the reality is the world of unchanging ideas. So what is real? So what the reality of the world, more on the ideas of unchanging ideas. Then the physical world, the reality, that's more on realism. Then pragmatism, from the word pragma, which means practical. So reality is an interaction of the individual and the environment. Then we have the existentialism. So I think you have also encountered that when you're still in college. Reality is the subjective interpretation of the physical world. So that's more on existentialism. Then on epistemology, knowing the personal rethinking of universal ideas. That's more on idealism. Then knowing is observing and understanding the natural law in realism. Then in the practical thing, knowing is the result of experience based on the scientific method. So there is already a result. Then knowing is making personal choice. That's on the existentialist point of view. Then on values, in idealism, values are absolute based on enduring ideas. Then realism, values are absolute based on the natural law. What is real? That's more on natural law. Then values are relative when we talk about pragma or pragmatism. In the existentialist point of view, values are chosen by the individual. Then the educational implication on idealism, the curriculum or curricula focus on the content that emphasizes time-honored ideas, while sa realism, the curricula focus on the content that emphasizes natural laws. Then the curricula and instruction focus on the problem solving and the scientific method, that's more on pragmatism. Then the last one, the existentialism, the instruction emphasizes the discussion designed to increase the individual self-awareness. So that's more on the traditional thought, a school of thoughts of philosophy. Next, in the epistemology, the first branch, know what is knowing, the knowledge. Okay, how we come up to know what we know. So there are a variety of ways of knowing exist. Like practice and experience are important. Then another thing, what is factual evidence? So examining your own belief. So the right knowledge, that's more on epistemology. So there is a variety of ways of knowing the one that is existing, especially the so-called being. Then the nature of knowledge and learning. So we have, you know what is knowledge, you know what is truth, and where did knowledge originate? In the mind, in the experiences, or in our observation? Then how did we come to know? Maybe according to Plato, sabi niya, we have the innate ideas. Okay? Kaya nga alam natin, bahagi na sa ating pagkatao. Then, how do we learn? That's more on experience. That's more on experience. Then, in metaphysics, we study beyond physics. What is the reality? What is being? Considers what we know. That's why this can be debatable. When I took up this subject, sabi ng aming professor, is there something inside this hole, yung butas? Okay? Ito yung pinag-usapan. May being ba dyan? Sabi ng isang classmate ko, I think there's a being if you go beyond, kung makita daw sa butas. But some said, the hole in itself, wala kang makikita. But the fact that this hole, okay, it occupies space. So, therefore, there is something there. So, yun yung, kaya nga, when you talk about reality, debatable din yan. Okay? Kung paano yan nag-i-exist. Kaya nga, independent of our perception exists, reality is objective and observable, then reality is actually perceived since our behavior depends on our perception. So, pwede rin, then, are people physically good? Or what or who is God? So, in metaphysics, we question, does God really exist? Is there God? So, yun yung pinag-usapan. Then, in the world of philosophy, of course, there are a lot of philosophers like Saint Thomas Aquinas, one of the doctor of the church. He was able to prove that God really exists, especially in his 5 ways. I think you also encountered that one when you were still in college, when you took up the basic, especially the subject of philosophy. Then the values, the axiology, values and ethics, debate, pwede ba? Yes, pwede rin. Values are caught, not taught. Pwedeng mapag-usapan din, pwedeng pagdebatihan. Then, we have the character education argues that values such as honesty and citizenship should be emphasized, taught, and rewarded. Pero tayo, wala naman tayong GMRC ngayon sa school. Tinanggal na sa character education. Kaya nga, may gustong ibalik naman uli kasi doon yung natuturuan. So, kita natin tong honesty only in the classroom. Kasulat dyan, honesty is the best policy. But it's sad to note that majority, na if not all, our politicians are graduate of the religious schools. But what happened? Where is honesty now? Mga idol ng iba, mga kawatan. Okay? So that's the problem. Okay? So that's more on the character, just more on values, knowing what is right and wrong, the good and evil. Then we have also moral education. So it's related to values also. The wrongness and badness of one's action emphasizes the development of students' moral reasoning and does not establish a list of values that learners should acquire. Then the question, what about beauty? Is beauty absolute or is it more or less? I'm getting paid to help kids learn. If I don't do my best, I'm not earning my salary. More on reasoning, values, and moral. That's why kaming mga teachers, because we were trained in our education that education is a noble vocation, noble profession, and it is a vocation, and it is a mission. But there are times, medyo masasaktan din kami na pinapangakuhan kami, mga teachers, ginagamit kami pag-election, pero sabi ni presidente natin ngayon, idol ninyo, na dodoblehin ko ang sweldo ng pulis, kayo yon, sundalo, kabaro din ninyo, at sa mga guro, kasi teacher ang nanay ko, mahirap. Pero hanggang ngayon, naalis na lang, where is the promise there? So, yun yung problema. Kasi wala pa rin nangyari sa mga teacher. Tapos sabi naman ng, anyway, this is part of our marites, but this is more on values. Pag sinabi mo kasi, dapat tuparin mo. Kasi doon mo masusukat na yung mga tao din na kaya nga, promises are not made to be broken. Pinaasa lang. But well, that's part of the so-called moral education. Kaya nga now, election time, maraming problema, especially in our church, in the Catholic Church, against sila sa mga taong corrupt. Kaya minsan, pasok agad about morality, moral ascendancy. Saan na yung iba? Itong taong ito walang moral ascendancy kasi kawatan, kurap, lahat-lahat na, makasalanan. Kaya minsan nagre-react din ako dyan talking about morality. Sabi ko, of all the 10 candidates, presidential, isa lang man talagang pumasa sa standard. Kaya nga, harap-harapan, sabihin na, ito lang talaga ang kaisa-isa na very pumasa sa criteria. I don't think so. That's still debatable. Kaya ito yung may values, ito yung talagang malinis. Okay? So, but well, that's more on morality, the moral education. Then the logic, the correct thinking, is the processing of deriving valid conclusions from the basic principles. You know, the deductive as well as the inductive reasoning in your mathematics. Then the major premise, which can be a principle of generalization. Remember your logic? The minor premise, the major, then the conclusion. Alaala niyo yun, may mga fallacy doon. Halimbawa, yung mga joke-joke noon, di ba? The ruler is 12 inches. Duterte is a ruler. So therefore, Duterte is ergo, di ba? Ganon tayo noon, is 12 inches. So that's a fallacy. But that's more on yung major premise, which can be the principle of generalization. Pero alam niyo yon, balikan niyo uli yon kasi nakaka-enjoy yung mga fallacy. Okay? Misericordiam, naalala niyo, Latin man yon. So there are a lot. Okay, that's more on correct thinking. So may fallacy dapat itama. Okay? Then, part of education, the terrain of philosophy, not in the book, which is idealism. Okay, being ideal. Since physical world is constantly changing, ideas are the only reliable form of reality. So more on this. Hayaan mo yung physical world nag-teach, but the idea more on, sabi nga in the philosophy of idealism, the reliable form of reality. In the ideal situation, what would you like to happen then? Like perfect marriage or teaching, you can be an ideal teacher, you can be an ideal police officer. As a husband or wife, you want to be a perfect, that's more on idealism. So as a person, very ideal talaga ako. That can be applied also. Realism, the features of the universe that exist whether or in human being or is there to perceive them, or the octave outside the window, you can perceive it to be anything you want, but it's still an oct. So, ano yung nakikita? What is real, that being? Like yung sa drawing nakita natin dyan. Then the philosophy of realism emphasizes more, anong obserbahan mo? More on experimentation and critical reasoning. Totoo ba talaga itong nakikita? Is this real? Okay? Kanina, idea. Ito naman, the being. Nakikita mo talaga, na obserbahan mo. And it can be done in experimentation. Then, you can reason out. By using our critical thinking or reasoning. Next. Practical. Sabi nga, pwedeng hindi makita sa libro. Sabi natin, pragmatism, which is practical. So pragmatism rejects the idea of absolute and changing truth. And why? Kasi practical man siya. Okay? Mag-aasawa ako ng teacher, practical lang sa mabuhay. Mag-aasawa ako ng pulis, kahit na wala ka trabaho, to be practical kasi mabubuhay ako. Kaya nga, the idea of the absolute and changing truth, yun, nare-reject niya yun. Okay, dito lang ako sa comfort zone to be practical. Okay? So instead, the truth is what works. Hence the term pragmatism. Experience the key ideas, then individuals need methods for dealing with changes. Then kung may problema man, practical lang yan, madali lang yan solusyonan. Okay, that's more on pragmatism. Then it does not de-emphasize the importance of knowledge. Ano ay? Basta anong makita, anong maipractice, anong practical, doon ako. That's more on pragmatism. Then, instead, it attempts to connect it to the children's interests. Kaya nga, in education, ganun yan. I think you are familiar with constructivism. Build knowledge rather than follow the rule. Demonstrate creating or understanding. Halimbawa, ibigay mo to sa batang problema, let that child discover the solution. Ano yung practical na magagawa niyang solusyon? Okay, that's more on education. Then, existentialism, humanity is not part of an orderly universe. Individuals create their own existence in their own unique way. So, sa lahat ng philosophy, ito din naiiba. Ano yung nag-exist, ano yung in my mind? It's up to the individual. Kaya nga sa philosophy, minsan parang mabuang tayo. Okay, mag-isip kasi kita na puro man iso siya tama. Especially, I think, the father of existentialism, si Soren Kierkegaard. I think you encountered that one in your college. So, ang hirap din ito intindihin. Kasi tama din. Okay? Then with freedom, it talks about freedom comes responsibility. Laala niyo si Lion King? Okay? With freedom comes responsibility. That's more on existentialist thinking. Emphasize on the individual. We don't teach math, science, reading, and writing. Kaya nga sabi ko, kailangan ba ituro? So, pwede naman siya, nag-exist ba ito? Tama kaya ito? Anong na masasabi ko? Then, sabi dito, we teach people, and the people we teach are the core of learning. So, it talks about the individual when it talk about to be existentialist. Tao ang pinag-usapan dito kung paano siya mag-isip. Kaya nga, sa curriculum, ayon sa education, it should be a learner-centered curriculum. Nakafocus talaga doon sa learner, sa bata, sa tao. When you talk about existentialism. Then, the philosophy of education, we have the so-called perennialism. Suggests that nature, including human nature, is constant. Constant ang tao. Hindi nagbabago. Okay? Kasi yun, tao siya. Constant siya. Then we have sinabi, another thing is essentialism. emphasizes a critical core of knowledge and skills that all students should learn. To be essential, dapat matuto sila. Human nature is constant. Dito naman, sa essentialism, na ang estudyante dapat matututo. Then we have progressivism, focus on the real world problem solving of the individual development. While the child is growing, natututo na din siya. This is more on progressivism. Then the next is the social reconstructivism. Reconstructionism contends that schools, teachers, and students should play a role in addressing social inequalities in our societies. Kaya nga, social reconstructionism. So, we all know na may pabor-pabor din sa society, then with this philosophy, dapat ituwid yun, i-correct yun, especially the inequalities of the society. And which is, alam naman natin yun, especially the poor, the rich and the poor, di ba? Talagang may problema yon. Okay? Not equal. Kaya nga in the mind, pumapasok itong Marxism din sa education. Ano nangyari? Dapat equality, revolution, para pantay-pantay lahat. So yon. That's another philosophy naman. So influential perennials, the nature, including human being, is constant, sabi na natin. Then education, we talk about the preparation for future life. I-educate natin yung bata for his or her life, for the future. Then math, science, and particular literature are also important, that they expose learners, when they talk perennials, to the rigors of logical thought, na mag-isip din, and the great ideas that have endured throughout history. This is more on classic, kung ano yung classical na pag-iisip din. Unlike now, iba na rin mag-isip mga kabataan ngayon. And why? Digital natives naman sila. Iba yung pag-iisip natin noon kaysa sa kanila ngayon. Kaya nga tayo, in our generation, mahirap din tayo nag-a-adjust. Kasi our training before is different from our children now. Kung napansin ninyo, kung digital native sila ngayon, kaya nga tayong mga tatay, mga nanay, dapat mag-level up din tayo para makisabay tayo. Kung Netflix sila ngayon pinanood, dapat sabayan din natin so that we can speak to their language. Okay? From classical, pero sabi nga, ito yung perennial. Then, classic works ranging from Homer's Iliad to Darwin's The Origin, especially in Darwinism, the evolution theory. Then, critic questions the value of distance and the abstract ideas for poorly motivated, intellectually unprepared students. Anong gawin doon? Especially yung the slow learner. Then, they also suggest that it is the elitist that places too much emphasis on ideas that are unrelated to the students' lives. So ito na yung pananaw din sa perennials. Okay? Dahil dito, yung emphasis on the ideas, which is elitist, yung may mataas na antas, na hindi man nakaka-relate, kagaya sa ating mga politician ngayon. Kaka-relate kaya sila? Sabi nga, si Pacquiao, ako lang nakaka-relate kasi galing ako sa hirap. Naghirap ako noon. Mga magsasaka, balot vendor, tendero, lahat-lahat na. Naranasan ko yun. So, maaring naranasan niya. Pero what about the elitist? Ay, ito yung sinasabi. Kaya nga, the question of education in the Philippines, especially sa DepEd, ito yung mga comments karamihan sa amin, and not only us but also the other educator na nagsasabi na halos lahat ng mga DepEd secretary, they were not trained as teacher sa talagang from the grassroots. Okay? Galing sa CHED. Of course, nagtuturo siya, pero iba yun. Elite yun. What about galing sa grassroots? Para malaman niya. Okay? Para walang inequality. Para makaka-relate yung mga estudyante dapat. That's more on the perennials. So, sinabi na natin ito, kailangan daw sa existentialist kasi tao ang focus dito. Back to the basics. Learning should focus the essential basic skills. So, ito na yon. Tao, learner, ang pinag-usapan dito. So, go back to the basic. And I think itong the 3 R's natin noon, okay, reading, writing, and arithmetic, naalaala pa ninyo. And to the content extent, with science and geography. Pero kung napansin nyo sa mga anak natin, minsan, ay, mas bright mas yung mga anak natin kasi elementary pa lang, pero ito mo yung subject natin sa high school. I don't know if you notice that one sa mga anak ninyo, kung napansin ninyo yan na kagrabe, isang katutak yung mga libro nila. Sa atin noon, wala tayong libro. Sino kayang mas bright? Pero ang maganda, go back to the physics, go back sa existentialism, go back to the 3 R's. What is basic? Then, reform aim of reforming teacher training. So, yan. Pwede kayo mag-go back to the 3 R's na may modern technology naman. Yes, it can be. Pwede naman. Halimbawa, ito yung sinasabi na sa tinitrain namin ng mga teacher educator, mga estudyante ko kumukuha ng education. If you'll be assigned na walang sa mga bundok, na walang kuryente, wala lahat, anong gagawin mo? So back to the basic. Kahit na gaano mo kagaling sa modern technology sa mga gadgets, hindi mo naman magamit, ma-assign ka sa liblib na lugar na wala talaga inaabot sa mga internet. So that's the problem. So back to the basic. Focus on the learner. That's more on existentialism. Essentialism naman, the dark at risk recommended at especially sa high school students, master core requirements, then the 5 basics, English, Mathematics, Social Studies, Computer Science. So yun yung mga subject dapat na basic. Pero ngayon, ang dami-dami ng dagdag kasi essential daw yon. Then the section of sequence of courses, the mastery of the teaching skills. Then the core knowledge exists that all pre-service leaders should master, like the base, knowledge base or the beginning teacher, especially those na bago lang mga graduate. So dapat mag-focus sila, especially itong thought na ito ng education na essentialism. What about essentialism as well as perennialism? I think nasabi ko na din natin ito. Are worry of the learner-centered education, then the essentialists emphasize the knowledge and skills that are useful into today's world. Then the standards of essential knowledge. Based on, there are critical core knowledge of all students should master. So bakit na-share ko ito sa inyo? Kasi this is just part of our philosophy of philosophical foundation of education or peace education. Then major role of the school should be to ensure that all students master the core of knowledge. Then critics of standards, the crucial knowledge is learned through the rote memorization, soon becoming forgotten and inert, and fails influence students' current or future lives. So mahirap din ito pag more on memorizing ni. Memorize. Pag nadapa, nakalimutan, wala nang alam. So that's the point there. Then what about progressivism? The problem-solving learning concepts, the curriculum focus on the real-world problem-solving and the individual development, then the insurance advertised, the progressive insurance. Then according to the critic, it places too much emphasis on the student's interest, self-esteem, then more on constructivism. Okay, hayaan mag-construct na estudyante para matuto sila. Hindi lang yung sabi sa critic nga, students' interest more on the self-esteem. So in the classrooms, you have to fast track on this. Then forming a personal philosophy of education. That's why philosophy is important. It helps you explain and defend your educational goals. That's why tayo, you will be doctor of philosophy. Kaya nga, bakit binalikan natin itong philosophy? Kasi sabi nga, defend your educational goals. And you will be asked, how come you, men in uniform, you take up this course, philosophy? Of course, you can defend that one to be practical because we are men in uniform and you can use this one in your own way. That's why I'm happy with that one of you, Colonel Concepcion, sumali din sa atin. By the way, he is already a doctor of management, but still, kaya nga I salute Sir Amado na nag-aral pa rin siya. Kailangan pa, yes, kailangan niya. Sabi niya, kailangan ko ito. In the future, magagamit ko itong peace education. So that's one good thing. Okay? That's why philosophy is very, very important. Then explain what you try to accomplish in your, if you're a teacher sa akin, in my classroom. Then sa classroom, hindi na natin siguro to, this more on sa amin mga teacher. Then the philosophy is evolving and dynamic. You know that one very well. Then second, your personal philosophy is likely to include elements of more than one traditional or educational philosophy. That's why one of the reflection na pinapagawa ko kung magturo akong philosophy is, what is your philosophy in life? Because that philosophy in life is your, it gives you direction, it gives you guide. Okay? Kung ano man yon, kayo lang nakakaalam, but I'll not ask with you. Then the third, in forming a philosophy, be willing to change your views if you find that they are an error. So papasok yung logic natin. Tama kaya ito? Okay kaya ito? So there is a need to broaden our horizon. Kung noon tayo ganyan exclusivist, why not broaden our horizon? Especially you now, na malapit na ngayon magdo-doctor of philosophy. At least malawak na yung pagtingin, hindi lang ganito. Like yung renda ng yung kabayo, mayroon silang ganyan. So ito lang ang tama. But for us, kayo mga doctor of philosophy in the future, broaden your horizon. Kung may mali, dapat itama. Kayo, saludo nga ako sa inyo because you are men and women in uniform. So alam na alam natin yon. That's why I'm very happy. Kaya nga, sa totoo lang, ang program ng Peace and Development, when I took the leadership as program head, wala, sige ako recruit sa mga pulis. Ano ay? Kasi ito yung nagpabuhay din sa aming programa. Kaya nga happy ako ngayon, dumadami na yun. May mga susunod na sa inyo, na sana makarecruit pa kayo. Mayroon na tayo kay BJMP, marami na tayong fire na graduate, kayo mga pulis, may general na nag-graduate, mga sundalo, mayroon na rin tayong malapit mag-general. I think familiar with Colonel Matalam, Colonel Makalintangi, mga sundalo yun sila. Okay? So mayroon na rin tayong mga MNLF na mga commanders doon na Doctor of Philosophy. So na-correct yung maling pananaw noon. They were able to broaden their horizon. That's part in forming philosophy. Then, in examining your beliefs, once identified, belief or the philosophy should be examined and analyzed. That's more on epistemol, more on knowledge. Tama kaya itong nasa isip ko? Or baka may higher idea pa na gusto kong malaman, matutunan para ma-broaden yung horizon ko. Remember Socrates? Kaya anong sabi ni Socrates? The unexamined life is not worth living. So it is related to this. Once identified your philosophy, should be examined and analyzed. Okay? More on ideas, the knowledge. Okay? That's more on epistemology. Okay? Examine your belief. Okay? Hindi lang yung magpakamatay ka dahil sa maling paniwala. Why not broaden your horizon? Like for example, when we talk about religion, sa magpakamatay talaga yan. Ito lang talagang tama. Dito tama ka lang. Go for it. But you don't have the right to condemn other religion. Broaden your horizon. Before you exist, kasi yung iba, judgmental, judge ka agad. Ganito, mali kayo. Pero in the Christian world, kami palaging kawawa. Ano ay? May cross si Brother Joars, Diyos-Diyusan yan. Pero pag kayo sabihan, Diyos-Diyusan din kayo. Di ba? Masakit. So that's the point there. So therefore, kung may mali, ito tama, analyze, then there's a need to re-examine that belief and that philosophy. Then this is where the epistemology becomes important. Our knowledge becomes important. How do we know that your beliefs are valid? Sabi dito, do you feel right? Pag yes, wala problema. Then, though they make sense intuitively, ayun, using your intuition, though they make sense intuitively. Okay? Pag para siya, okay, go for it. Wala problema. But intuitively, your intuition would tell you na may problema, especially if you judge other. others. So that's the point. Then, is feeling or intuition adequate to justify beliefs? Or must you have research evidences to indicate that they are valid? Ayan. Kaya nga, balik tayo sa example, especially mga kapatid namin na mga sa kapwa ko na mga Kristiyano na ibang pananampalataya. What is real is in the Bible. Ito talagang truth. Wala nang iba. Dito lahat dapat. What about the other evidences? Okay? So that's the pointer. Wala. So ang alam nila paninira lang. Evidence would tell me na ganito. In the Bible, ganito. Hindi naman. May mga misinterpretation, wrong interpretation, then they justify that belief. Mali yon. Your intention would tell you, uy, may problema because you tend to destroy others, especially the other religion. So that's the point there. Okay? So it's good to examine once again your philosophy, our philosophy in life. Then if you know, if not everything, and with that, since we broaden our horizon, nando yung papasyong respect. Ganyan mang pananaw niya, hindi ko na yung kontrahin. Ito man ding pananaw ko. So therefore, kung malawak na, kung friend mo yon, we have to compromise. Win-win situation. Meet at the center. That's according to Stephen Covey. Familiar with Stephen Covey? Nanalo ka, nanalo siya. So meet, compromise, integrate everything. Meet at the center. Okay? Hindi yung manatili ka pa rin sa belief mo na sirain yung iba. Magka-problema tayo dyan. Baka hindi mo ni-examine yung philosophy in life mo. Okay? That's why I'm happy dito sa Cotabato State University. Kristiyano man ako, majority sa friend ko mga Musliman, I'm happy na hindi kami nag-away. Kasi na-broaden na yung horizon. But, to tell you frankly, there are still really some, only few na talagang exclusivist mag-isip. Kahit na doktor pa o philosophy, pero exclusivist mag-isip. Sabi ko nga, examine your belief, examine your philosophy once again. Open your horizon. Pero hindi ko man masabihan, baka mapatay tayo. Pero the point there, dapat alam nila yon. Okay? So yan. So we'll fast track this one. This is more on the classroom. So ito yung sinabi natin kanina. Okay? The theories as well as the ideas. Then, with that, I hope this introductory part will help you develop also our own philosophy and na-review din natin kahit na konti man lang what we have learned in our philosophy when we are still in college. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something. God bless us all. Dalaygon ang Diyos.